So in this video, we'll be looking at what are the consequences of economic growth. Very important topic because it's an AO3 topic, which means Assessment Objective 3, which you will use for your essay question. So it's important in that sense because it can be something like a 15-mark question or a 10-mark question. Okay, so we can divide these consequences into three parts. Consequences on the living standards, on the environment, and on income distribution. Now, if there's economic growth, there would definitely be an increase in the standard of living and an increase in spending in the economy. So, mostly all sections of society would start spending more, which would increase living standards. Now, a good way to look at this is to go back to the equation of GDP, which is C, consumption spending, plus I, investment spending, which is what firms do. Consumption spending is what consumers do. G stands for government spending, what governments do, and XN stands for net exports, which is exports minus imports. If we look at this equation, we can easily sum up what would happen to, as a consequence of economic growth, because economic growth means the increase of real GDP. So if there's an increase in real GDP, it would mean an increase in consumer spending. Now, this would happen because more people have jobs and unemployment is falling, so lots of people start spending. So that's definitely a positive of economic growth. In the same vein, for the same component of C, there is a negative as well, which is there could be an increase of spending on demerit goods like cigarettes or alcohol. So all of those are demerit goods and they're socially undesirable, and the use of them will lead to decrease of social welfare and market failure, so that's not really a good thing. Okay, another positive consequence would be increase in investment spending by firms. Now, they would invest more into capital and increase their capital stock, and that would definitely be a big positive, because the increase in capital stock, the capital expenditure for economy is very, very important. We saw that when we studied what is economic growth, when we looked at it in the PPC, we saw that not only does it lead to short-run economic growth, but also long. So investment spending is that way really important to increase the capital stock and the productive capacity of the economy. It can lead to an increase in not just the quantity of factors of production, but due to economic growth, firms can even increase the quality of factors of production, maybe employing more capital, maybe by using technology to make the land more productive, etc., etc. So that's definitely a positive. Whenever, in fact, there is an increase in investment spending, that's very positive for the economy, and it doesn't just lead to short-term economic growth but also long-term economic growth. Another positive, the next component after C and I is G, which is government spending. So there can definitely be an increase in government spending due to economic growth, at least theoretically. Why is that? Simply because there would be an increase in tax revenues. The government would take taxes from consumers. As they do more consumer spending, the government can increase taxes and get more tax revenues. Even if they do not increase tax revenues, there would be more people spending, and that's how the tax revenues would increase. And almost always whenever there is economic growth, whenever there's an increase in living standards, we see governments actually increase the rate of tax. And since there's a decrease in unemployment, that means a lot of people would now have added income, and that income will lead to spending, which will lead to an increase in spending tax, consumption tax or sales tax. There would also be an increase in income tax because of the incomes that people are earning. So that's an increase in income tax for the government, again a tax revenue. Another tax could be an import tax. So because firms would import raw materials, for instance, or consumers use imported goods, finished goods, in any case there could be import taxes that the government would impose, and that would also increase their tax revenues. So now that increased tax revenues can be used by the government for various things. They could provide more public goods, they could provide more merit goods, like education and healthcare, and all of that would ultimately lead to not just increase in living standards, but also increase in the quality of life for the country. And that increase in quality of life could lead to a decrease in absolute poverty because of greater incomes, greater access to healthcare, etc., greater transportation that the government would provide, increasing public and merit goods, etc. Now remember, we're looking at theory. This is all theoretically what would happen, but a good way to kind of look at this would be to go into particular case studies and look at different countries and how this really applies to them. Okay, what are the negatives? We saw one negative, increase in consumption or demerit goods. Another huge negative is because of all that spending, it could lead to an increase in demand pull inflation. Now, if you recall, demand pull inflation is the increase of aggregate demand, excess aggregate demand. So that means that would be a conflict of the macroeconomic objective of economic growth and inflation. So this is again something that we discuss and you have in the syllabus, and that you will be writing about which macroeconomic objectives conflict with each other and what is the solution. It would also decrease international competitiveness. If there's a country with high inflation, another country, the trading partners, would prefer to trade with a country with a lower rate of inflation so that they would get the maximum benefit out of it. So it would definitely lead to a decrease of international competitiveness, which is a very important factor in today's day and age for a globalized world. And it could also increase income inequality. We'll see more about income inequality when we discuss income distribution. This point could be a little surprising, like if living standards are increased, if income is increasing, if unemployment is decreasing, then income inequality should actually decrease. Well, there is no hard evidence that income inequality decreases. In fact, it is often seen that the opposite, that it doesn't really help, economic growth doesn't really help to decrease income inequality. Okay, now all of these positives, living standard increase, economic growth obviously being a good thing, some negatives we saw. The opportunity cost is the environment. We can look at the environment as a big opportunity cost because almost nothing good comes out of economic growth for the environment unless and until that economic growth is sustainable in nature. If it is based on, sustainable energy sources, which is still limited all over the world. So air pollution, water pollution, plastic pollution, road congestion, climate change, loss of biodiversity, all of these are the negative consequences on the environment of economic growth. Apart from that, we looked at an increase of consumption on demerit goods, which leads to negative externalities. That's a form of market failure. Another form of market failure is overfishing because of all of these harmful effects on the environment, and you have economic growth, a lot of people going in for fishing. That would be overfishing. It could be deforestation, and this was a market failure called as tragedy of the commons, if you recall. So that's what you can connect over here. You can talk about also a decrease in social well-being because of this kind of market failure, because we saw that there'll be a loss of social welfare. So that's something you can bring in over here when you talk about the environment. Also, economic well-being will reduce Again, overfishing would lead to that, deforestation will lead to that, and also emotional well-being, especially if we look at the pandemic and we see that how important it is really for people to be connected with nature, and that would decrease as well, and a decrease in quality of life. So overall, where we see on one hand that living standards increase, and we say that the standard of living would increase, spending would increase. On the other hand, on the flip side, we see that the quality of life might actually decrease. So where is the balance? Now the balance would come when the environment is kept in mind. Economic growth, when you ignore the environment, it's a huge opportunity cost. So sustainable sources of energy, looking at using electric cars, for instance, all of that would at least not harm the environment, while at the same time leading towards sustainable economic growth. Economic growth which isn't sustainable will definitely harm the environment. This is why we have the concept of green GDP, and we look at that also in another video. What is green GDP, definition, formula, etc. Okay, the third category we can look at is income distribution. Now, economic growth can definitely increase income inequality, because that growth is not going to be felt equally across all sections of society, which means that some poor people, or the poorest of the poor, might actually, that gap might actually widen. The rich might become richer, the poor get poorer. That is very evident in developed economies like America, and it's even evident in developing economies. A positive from this is definitely the tax revenues. Now the government, as we spoke earlier, can provide more merit goods, more public goods, because of the increase in the tax revenues which they get from income, spending, profits, and the sale of imports. And they can use these tax revenues to redistribute the income and wealth in society. So things like, say, unemployment benefits, or pension funds, or student loans, all of these things can be done by the government with that increased tax revenues that they have. So the possibilities are endless. This is, of course, in theory, and how much is it actually applicable is another story. So make sure to look at case studies, look at countries, and try to apply these points whenever you write your essay. You cannot just write about it in terms of just the points. These will form the base, but you have to supplement it with a lot of real-life examples to explain what you're talking about.